Humiliated, Serafina was auctioned off like property, her soul about to be sold to a monster. Then a dark stranger appeared, outbidding everyone with a mountain of cash. He wasn't a savior. He was Enzo Moretti, the city's most feared mafia boss, annihilating her tormentors. Now she's safe, but utterly claimed by a man who controls her every breath. What dark price awaits her? There in the Sapphire Lounge, always tasted of ghosts and faded dreams. Even at dawn, before the city truly woke, a faint melancholic aroma clung to the velvet-draped walls, a blend of stale cigarette smoke, spilled whiskey, and the sweet, lingering essence of countless jazz notes that had once soared through the space. Serafina Rossi ran a hand over the cold, chipped ivory keys of the grand piano, a shiver tracing its way down her spine. The silence now was a heavy shroud, pressing down on her, far more suffocating than any raucous cheer from a bygone era. Her father, a man whose hands could make a piano weep and sing, had believed in this place with a feverish devotion that ultimately devoured him. And now it was devouring her too. Her fingers, usually so nimble and expressive, trembled slightly as they brushed across the dusty keyboard. The Sapphire Lounge wasn't just a building. It was a beating heart. Yet it was slowly, agonizingly, being strangled by the weight of her father's gambling debts. Debts that had blossomed into a monstrous, hydra-headed beast after his sudden silent departure from this world a year ago. Each head was a new threat, a new demand, a new piece of paper with a sum that mocked her meager earnings. And the most venomous head belonged to Silas Thorne. The name itself was a jagged shard of ice in her gut. He wasn't just a lone shark, he was a predator, a man whose smile held the promise of decay, whose eyes seemed to strip away layers of skin just to see the fear beneath. His last call, a mere 24 hours ago, still echoed in the hollow chambers of her mind, a low guttural growl that promised far worse than financial ruin. The club, or you, little songbird? The choice is rapidly vanishing. The unspoken implication hung heavy, a miasma of terror. He wanted more than money. He wanted to own her body and soul. The thought alone made her stomach churn, a bitter taste rising in her throat. She clenched her jaw, the phantom taste to bile a familiar companion these days. Serafina pushed herself away from the piano, the old bench creaking in protest, a sound as mournful as her own suppressed sigh. She walked through the deserted club, her worn sneakers barely making a sound on the scuffed wooden floor. The stage, where she had once envisioned herself captivating audiences with her own compositions, now stood empty, bathed in the pale, indifferent glow of a single bare bulb. It felt less like a stage and more like a gallows. Every chipped glass, every threadbare cushion on the booths, every faded photograph on the wall, they were all silent witnesses to the slow, agonizing death of her family's legacy. And she was powerless to stop it. No, not powerless. The thought, small and defiant, sparked in the desolate landscape of her mind. She might be cornered, she might be broken, but she wasn't shattered. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in her lungs and a desperate, burning ember of hope for the Sapphire Lounge. That ember was why she endured the nights at the Viper's Denver. She looked down at her hands. These hands, meant for coaxing melodies from a piano, were now accustomed to carrying trays laden with expensive liquor, to wiping down sticky tables, to enduring the leering glances of men whose wealth reeked of something illicit and dangerous. The Viper's Denver. It was a gilded cage of vice, a labyrinth of whispered deals and clinking chips, where the air was thick with the scent of power, expensive cigars, and the desperation of those who lived and died by chance. And she, Serafina, the musician, the inheritor of a fading dream, was merely a shadow flitting through its opulent halls, serving the very kind of men who fed on people like her father. Her uniform for the Viper's Den was a stark contrast to her own worn jeans and threadbare sweaters, a short, form-fitting black dress that barely covered her knees, a pristine white apron tied around her waist, and sensible, though equally worn, black flats. It felt like a costume, a disguise she donned to shed the identity of Serafina Rossi, the proud artist, and become Santos, the invisible waitress. A name as common as dirt, as forgettable as a forgotten melody. The humiliation was a constant, dull ache beneath her skin, a brand she carried. Every time a patron's hand lingered too long on her arm, every time a gruff voice demanded service, a wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm her. She hated it. She hated every single moment. But she did it. For the sapphire. For her father's memory. For the faint, stubborn hope that she could still pull it back from the abyss. As dusk began to paint the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, Serafina prepared for her shift. The small apartment above the club, once filled with her father's hearty laughter and the joyous chaos of impromptu jam sessions, now echoed with her own quiet anxieties. She peered into the cracked mirror, seeing not just her own tired face, but the ghosts of generations of Rossis who had poured their souls into this place. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were shadowed with fatigue, but a stubborn glint remained, tiny spark of rebellion. She tied her dark hair back, securing it with a simple elastic, her movements practiced and resigned. The clock on the wall ticked with an unnerving slowness, each second a hammer blow against her dwindling hope. The short walk to the Viper's Den was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The neon glow of the club sign, a menacing viper coiled around a diamond, pulsed with a predatory energy. The heavy oak doors, guarded by two hulking men with impassive faces, felt like the maw of a beast. She took a deep breath, inhaling the chill autumn air, trying to steel herself. Tonight was just another night. Another night of invisible service, of fending off unwanted advances, of earning just enough to keep the wolves at bay for a few more days. She pushed through the kitchen doors, the cacophony of clanking dishes and shouted orders immediately assaulting her senses. The air was thick with the smell of expensive food, cheap perfume, and a faint metallic tang she couldn't quite place. Another shift. Another night of living on the edge. Unbeknownst to Serafina, tonight would be anything but ordinary. Tonight, the very air in the Viper's Den crackled with an unspoken tension, an anticipation of something grand and dangerous. Tonight, a particular shadow would fall across her path, a shadow unlike any she had encountered before. And in a matter of moments, her carefully constructed, fragile world would shatter, making way for a destiny she could neither escape nor comprehend. She just didn't know it yet. All she knew was the weight of the champagne tray in her hands, and the urgent command from her manager to serve the high-stakes poker table in the private VIP room. A table where a new, formidable presence had just settled, his aura of power so palpable it seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. The weight of the silver tray in Serafina's hands felt like a leaden anchor dragging her down. 3 flutes of vintage champagne, each worth more than she earned in a week, sparkled precariously, their delicate stems threatening to snap with every subtle tremor of her exhausted body. The air in the VIP section of the Viper's Den was a suffocating blend of expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of ambition. Low murmurs and the rhythmic click-clack of poker chips formed a dangerous symphony, a backdrop to the quiet desperation that clung to her like a second skin. Her manager, a portly man with a perpetually sour expression named Frank, had barked the order at her just moments ago. Table 5 Santos. VIPs don't wait. And for God's sake, don't break anything, unless you want to pay for it out of your non-existent wages. His words, delivered with a sneer, were a fresh wound, a reminder of the ever-present threat of financial ruin. Silas Thorne. His image, chilling and predatory, flickered behind her eyelids. His voice, a low rumble of insidious promises, seemed to reverberate in the very bones of her skull. The club? Were you, little songbird? He hadn't just threatened her family's legacy. He had threatened her very being, her sense of self, her fragile hope for a future free from his grasp. The memory made her hands clench, a tremor running through her. She was so close to losing everything. So irrevocably, devastatingly close. Her vision blurred for a split second, a dizzying wave of fatigue and fear washing over her. She blinked, forcing the image of Thorne's cruel smile away, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. The polished mahogany floor gleamed underfoot, reflecting the subdued glow of crystal chandeliers. Her worn black flats, usually so reliable, suddenly felt treacherous. One misplaced step, and then it happened. A flicker of movement from a shadowy figure at an adjacent table, perhaps a carelessly extended leg, or just her own profound exhaustion, sent a jolt through her. Her foot caught, twisted, and the world tilted. Time seemed to stretch, agonizingly slow. The silver tray flew from her grasp, the champagne flutes arcing through the air like doomed, glittering projectiles. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. No, please no. The crashing symphony of breaking glass was deafening in the sudden, eerie silence that followed. Shards of crystal glittered on a pristine carpet like malevolent jewels. And then the sickening sight, golden, effervescent liquid cascading down a figure seated at the very head of table 5, soaking the immaculate, dark fabric of his tailored suit. The entire VIP room, moments ago alive with hushed conversations and the clink of money, fell utterly, completely silent. Every eye, cold and judgmental, snapped towards her. Serafina froze, a deer caught in the headlights, her breath hitched in her throat. Her body was a rigid block of terror, every nerve screaming. And then she looked at him. He was Enzo Moretti. The shadow, the name, whispered in reverent, fearful tones throughout the Viper's den, was synonymous with absolute power, with a darkness so profound it was almost tangible. She had only ever glimpsed him from a distance, a formidable presence at the most exclusive tables, an aura of quiet menace that demanded deference. Now he was directly in front of her, drenched in the sticky sweetness of champagne, his presence filling her entire field of vision. He didn't move. Not a muscle twitched in his stark, aristocratic face. His dark hair, slicked back from a high, intelligent forehead, remained perfectly in place. His eyes, the color of obsidian, were fixed on her. There was no anger there, no immediate flash of fury that she had anticipated, that she had braced herself for. Instead, there was a chilling, almost unnerving stillness. A profound, assessing curiosity that felt infinitely more dangerous than any rage. He slowly, deliberately, reached a hand to his wrist. His movements were fluid, precise, a predator's grace. He wiped a single, glistening drop of champagne from the face of his watch, a heavy, dark piece of craftsmanship that probably cost more than the Sapphire Lounge and all its contents combined. The air around him seemed to crackle, thick with unspoken power. "Careful, Kara." His voice. It was a low rumble, a dangerous purr that resonated deep within her chest, sending an unbidden shiver through her. It was deep, laced with an undeniable authority, and utterly devoid of warmth. Some debts are paid in blood. The words weren't a direct threat, not in the way Thorn's were. They were a statement of fact, a chilling reminder of the world he inhabited, a world where carelessness had tangible, brutal consequences. And she, Serafina, had just committed an unforgivable act of carelessness directly upon him. Her throat was tight, her tongue a lead weight. She wanted to apologize, to grovel, to disappear into the very floorboards beneath her feet. But no sound would come. She was caught in the terrifying, magnetic pull of his gaze. Those obsidian eyes were dissecting her, peeling back layers of her carefully constructed facade, seeing not just the clumsy waitress, but something more. Something he found intriguing. And the thought, terrifying as it was, ignited a strange, unwelcome spark deep within her. The way he looked at her felt like a claim, a dangerous branding. He paused, his gaze still locked onto hers, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, waved a hand. It was a dismissal, silent and absolute. The two hulking men standing behind his chair, as immobile as statues until now, moved with quiet efficiency, signaling to a manager who quickly approached. "Clean this up," Enzo stated, his voice now devoid of any personal address, cold and detached. He didn't even look at the mess or at her. He merely leaned back in his plush leather chair, his dark suit still gleaming despite the damp patches, his attention already shifting back to the poker table. The cards, somehow, seemed to hold more interest than the shattered chaos she had created. But the moment wasn't over. Not for her. And not, she instinctively knew, for him. From across the room, at a smaller, less prominent table, a pair of eyes, cold and calculating, watched the entire exchange. Silas Thorne. A flicker of something malevolent, something calculating, crossed his face. He'd seen the interaction, witnessed Enzo Moretti's unsettling non-reaction, and perhaps, more importantly, he'd seen the way Enzo had looked at Serafina. A slow, predatory smile began to stretch across Thorne's lips. The game, he seemed to realize, had just gotten a new, far more dangerous player. And Serafina, trapped between the devil she knew and the shadow she had just doused, felt a new, chilling fear seep into her bones. Her life, already a precarious tightrope walk, had just plunged into a far more treacherous, alluring, and deadly dance. She had spilled champagne on a king, and now she knew he had seen her. And she was utterly, devastatingly, afraid of what he would do with that sight. The Sapphire Lounge felt colder than usual, even with the weak afternoon sun attempting to pierce through the grimy windows. Serafina stood on the small, worn stage, running a feather duster over the antique piano. Each stroke felt less like cleaning and more like a futile attempt to breathe life back into something already dying. The silence in the club was oppressive, a stark contrast to the vibrant melodies that once filled this space. Her father's spirit, usually a comforting presence, now felt like a mournful echo, a silent accusation. The jarring trill of her cheap burner phone sliced through the quiet, making her jump. Her heart immediately began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't need to see the caller ID. Her stomach clenched, bile rising in her throat. Taking a deep, fortifying breath that tasted of dust and despair, she answered, "Santos. Thought you'd learn to pick up faster." Silas Thorne's voice, oily and laced with mock pleasantry, slithered through the receiver. It was like a poisonous snake coiling around her ear. "Tick-tock, little songbird. Time's up. I told you, Mr. Thorne, I'm trying. I just need a little more time," Serafina pleaded, her voice a desperate, thin thread. A harsh, humorless laugh cut her off. "Time? Time is a luxury you can no longer afford, my dear. The agreement was clear. If the balance isn't settled by sunset tomorrow, the sapphire, including every dusty key on that old piano, is mine. And as for your personal services to make up the difference, well, let's just say I have a rather eager clientele. You're quite the exotic bird, you know?" The thinly veiled threat, dripping with lecherous intent, made her skin crawl. Her free hand instinctively clutched the phone, knuckles white, as if she could choke the words before they reached her. "No, you can't. I won't." "Oh, but I can, and you will," Thorne purred, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that chilled her to the bone. "You have no leverage, Santos. No one will help you. Trust me, I've seen to that. So be a good girl. Be at the Viper's Den tomorrow night. We'll finalize the transfer. And then we'll discuss your new arrangements. Don't be late." He hung up, leaving her with the dead air of the phone and the horrifying echo of his promise. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the cold stage floor, the feather duster falling forgotten from her hand. Tears, hot and stinging, finally breached the dam she had so painstakingly built around her emotions. She was trapped. Utterly, irrevocably trapped. The next 24 hours were a blur of frantic, futile efforts. She tried to call every number she knew, every distant relative, every friendly face from her father's past. The antique piano, her grandmother's treasured heirloom, was hauled to a pawn shop whose owner took one look at her desperate eyes and offered a laughably insulting sum, clearly sensing her vulnerability. "Not enough, darling. Not for that kind of debt." Each rejection was a hammer blow to her already fragile spirit, a fresh layer of humiliation piled upon the last. Friends, once so quick to praise her talent, now averted their eyes, whispering apologies, clearly terrified of incurring Thorne's wrath themselves. The world, it seemed, had decided to conspire against her. By the time she arrived at the Viper's Den the following evening, Serafina felt like a ghost, her body moving on autopilot, her soul hollowed out by despair. The black waitress uniform felt like a shroud, a mark of her impending doom. She had tried to make herself invisible, to blend into the shadows, but tonight, all eyes seemed to find her. The atmosphere in the main room of the club was different, a peculiar blend of anticipation and morbid curiosity. The usual clinking of chips and hushed conversations had given way to a palpable hum of excitement. A temporary stage had been erected in the center of the room, starkly lit by a single, unforgiving spotlight. It was less a stage for entertainment and more a cruel pedestal. Serafina's stomach churned as she recognized the setup. This wasn't just a transfer. This was a spectacle. Her public execution. Thorne, resplendent in a custom-tailored suit that seemed to reek of avarice, stood beside a podium on the makeshift stage, a triumphant, predatory smirk plastered across his face. He held a gavel in one hand, the other resting proprietarily on a stack of documents that Serafina knew, with a sickening certainty, were the deeds to the Sapphire Lounge. His eyes, when they found hers, glittered with malicious glee. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests," Thorne's voice boomed through the club, amplified by hidden speakers, dripping with false bonhomie. "Tonight, we have a unique opportunity. The charming Miss Santos here," he gestured toward Serafina, who stood numbly near the edge of the stage, feeling every leering gaze in the room like a physical blow, "find herself in a rather precarious financial situation. And being the benevolent sort that I am, I've arranged a little auction." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, thick with insinuation. Serafina felt her cheeks burn with shame, hot tears pricking at her eyes. She fought them back fiercely. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not entirely. "First," Thorne continued, savoring the moment, "we have the deed to the Sapphire Lounge, a prime piece of real estate, ripe for development, owned by the Santos family for generations. We'll start the bidding at $1 million. The bids came quickly, a flurry of hands and shouted numbers, each one driving a nail deeper into Serafina's coffin. The amount soared, but even as it did, she knew it wasn't enough to cover the exorbitant interest Thorne had slapped onto her father's original debt. This was just a show. The real prize, she knew, was her. Then, Thorne's gaze locked onto hers, a vile triumph in his eyes. And now for the true jewel of the evening. Miss Santos herself. A talented musician, a dedicated worker, and in need of a benefactor. He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the smoke-filled air. Her services. To the highest bidder. "What am I offered for exclusive access?" The words were a direct assault, stripping her of dignity, parading her humiliation for a room full of depraved men. A wave of nausea, cold and visceral, washed over her. She gripped the edge of the velvet curtain beside her, her knuckles white. Her vision swam, the faces in the crowd blurring into a sea of hungry, predatory eyes. This was it. Then. She was about to be sold, like chattel, her dreams, her body, her very soul offered up to the highest, most repugnant bidder. Just as a man in the front row, his face bloated with whiskey and lust, began to raise his hand, a seismic shift occurred. The hum of the crowd abruptly died. A sudden potent silence descended, heavier and more menacing than any she had ever known. It wasn't just a lack of sound. It was an absorption of it, as if the very air had become too dense to carry noise. Enzo Moretti. He stood framed in the archway of the VIP section, not making a grand entrance, but simply appearing. His presence was an almost physical force, radiating an icy, absolute authority that parted the crowd like water. He moved with a predator's grace, his custom-tailored suit a dark, immaculate silhouette against the muted lighting. Every eye in the room, including Thorne's, now turned to him, fear and deference etched onto every face. Serafina's breath hitched. Her heart, which moments ago had been a frantic drum, now froze in her chest, a terrified, wondrous stillness. He was here. The shadow. Enzo walked directly towards the stage, his gaze sweeping the room with a chilling, proprietary possessiveness that settled heavily on Serafina. His obsidian eyes, darker than any night, seemed to strip away her fear, her shame, and leave her utterly exposed, but also, paradoxically, seen. He stopped directly in front of Thorn, who, for the first time, looked genuinely uneasy, his triumphant smirk having vanished, replaced by a flicker of pure apprehension. Thorn. Enzo's voice was a low growl, a dangerous, barely suppressed tremor of power that sent shivers through the entire room. It was not a question, but a condemnation. Thorn, attempting to regain his composure, chuckled nervously. Mr. Moretti, an unexpected pleasure. Perhaps you're interested in the Santos Girls Club? A fine establishment with... Enzo cut him off with a single, dismissive flick of his wrist. The charade ends now. He nodded subtly to one of his men, a massive figure who stepped forward, placing a gleaming black leather briefcase onto the podium. With a sharp click, it opened, revealing stacks upon stacks of crisp $100 bills. A staggering, astronomical sum that overflowed the case, spilling slightly onto the polished wood. More money than Serafina had ever seen in her life. More money than Thorn had ever dreamed of. The club, Enzo's voice cut through the stunned silence, cold and definitive, and Ms. Rossi's freedom. They are now mine. His gaze, sharp as a blade, turned back to Thorn. And as for your petty games, Thorn, he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow still carried to every corner of the silent room, you just incurred a debt you can never repay. Thorn's face went ashen, his bravado crumbling like dry earth. Before he could utter a single syllable of protest, two of Enzo's men, moving with terrifying swiftness, flanked him, their grip like iron. Thorn was escorted, not gently, off the stage and out of the club, his pleas and protests quickly muffled by the heavy doors. His reign, at least over Serafina, was irrevocably over. Serafina watched, bewildered, as her tormentor was removed. A wave of profound, disorienting relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. She was safe. For now. He had saved her. Then Enzo turned fully to her. His dark eyes, intense and unyielding, pinned her where she stood. There was no warmth, no comfort in his gaze, only a deep, dangerous possessiveness that sent a fresh wave of primal fear through her. She had been bought, saved from one monster, only to be claimed by another, far more powerful one. You are no longer bound by Thorn, Enzo stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that brooked no argument. He stepped closer, his imposing presence engulfing her, casting her in his formidable shadow. You are bound by me, Serafina. He didn't ask. He simply stated. Consider your debts transferred. Your club is secure. Your future is now mine to dictate. Her breath hitched again, but this time it was from a different kind of fear, mingled with a strange, undeniable spark of intrigue. The golden cage had just opened, but she had been thrust into a different one, wrought from steel and shadows, commanded by a king. And as he reached out his hand gently, possessively, taking her arm, she knew her life would never be her own again. The question was, what kind of life would it be under the dangerous, unyielding claim of Enzo Moretti? The air in Enzo Moretti's penthouse was thick with the scent of polished wood, expensive leather, and something undefinably masculine that made Serafina's senses prickle. She had been here for 3 days. 3 interminable days, each one a shimmering, gilded cage. The estate wasn't an estate in the traditional sense, but the entire top floor of one of the city's most exclusive skyscrapers, a sprawling testament to power and meticulously curated wealth. Marble gleamed underfoot, reflecting the breathtaking city lights that stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Artworks that cost more than her wildest dreams hung silently on the walls. Yet, despite the undeniable luxury, every breath felt shallow, every movement constrained. She was not a prisoner in chains, but in silk. New clothes, soft and expensive, filled a walk-in closet larger than her old apartment. Meals, exquisitely prepared, arrived at precise intervals. Her every unspoken need seemed to be anticipated by a silent, efficient staff who moved like phantoms, never meeting her gaze directly. It was a suffocating kind of care, a luxury that felt more like surveillance. She had exchanged the crushing anxiety of destitution for the isolating comfort of absolute control. Freedom? The word tasted like ash on her tongue. He had bought her freedom from Thorn, yes, but he had claimed her life in return. The memory of his words, low and resonant, still echoed in her mind. Your future is now mine to dictate. He hadn't asked. He hadn't negotiated. He had simply claimed. And she, caught in the terrifying vortex of his power, had been too stunned, too relieved to resist. Her own bedroom, a sanctuary of muted tones and plush textures, offered no true escape. There was no lock on the inside. No way to simply walk out. She tried the heavy, ornate door leading to the main living area on the first morning. It was locked. She tried the floor's private elevator. It required a keycard she did not possess. Her heart had plummeted, a cold stone in her chest. A fresh wave of resentment, sharp and bitter, had washed over her. She paced the polished floors, her new slippers silent against the marble, a furious, caged bird. On the second evening, she had ventured into the sprawling living room, drawn by the distant, almost imperceptible strains of classical music, something she hadn't realized she craved until its absence became a dull ache. She found Enzo there, seated in a low-backed armchair, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, the city lights painting stark shadows across his formidable features. He didn't look up immediately, his intense gaze fixed on something she couldn't discern beyond the glass. The air around him was charged, a static field of latent power. Is there something you require, Serafina? His voice, a low thrum that vibrated through the vast space, was devoid of inflection, yet it somehow sent a shiver down her spine. He used her full name, a stark reminder of his claim. Just as she managed, her voice a little too sharp, a little too defiant for her own good. She immediately regretted it. But the words were out. A small act of rebellion. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian, analyzing her. You have the freshest air, the highest air. This city breathes at my feet. I meant freedom, she retorted, her voice gaining a desperate edge she couldn't quite temper. I meant the ability to choose when and where I breathe it. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of something deeper, more predatory. Freedom, Kara, is a luxury few truly possess. You have traded a brutal, certain ruin for a controlled, secure existence. A better bargain, would you not agree? A bargain I had no say in. Her voice rose, indignation momentarily eclipsing her fear. You bought me like property. His eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint entering their depths. He set his glass down on a nearby side table with a soft, deliberate thud that resonated in the quiet. You were property, Serafina. Thorn intended to sell you. I simply outbid him. Consider it a rescue. He rose, his tall, imposing form unfolding with a lethal grace. He moved towards her slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body. Smell the expensive, subtle cologne that clung to him. It was intoxicating, dangerous. And now you belong to me. A debt paid, a claim staked. It is the way of my world. The way of our world. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, his gaze unwavering, intense. She instinctively flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. His hand paused, then slowly, gently, brushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, yet it seared her skin, sending a jolt of unsettling awareness through her. It was a possessive gesture, a silent declaration. Her breath hitched. She looked into his eyes, searching for malice, for cruelty, but found only an unyielding, dangerous certainty. And something else, something she couldn't quite name, a raw intensity that both terrified and inexplicably drew her in. She wanted to pull away, to lash out, but his proximity, his undeniable power, held her captive. Later that night, Unable to sleep, Serafina wandered the penthouse again. She discovered a small, unassuming room, tucked away behind a library filled with leather-bound tomes. Inside, bathed in the soft glow of a standing lamp, sat a grand piano. Not quite as old as the sapphires, but magnificent instrument nonetheless, its polished ebony surface gleaming. A wave of profound relief, mixed with a pang of longing, washed over her. Her hands, restless and aching for the familiar touch of keys, gravitated towards it. She sat down, her fingers hesitating for a moment, then finally finding their home on the cool ivory. A soft melody, mournful and yearning, filled the room, a lament for lost dreams and stolen freedoms. She played, pouring all her despair, her anger, her bewildered fascination into the music. It was a jazz piece her father had taught her, full of improvisational melancholy and unexpected hope. She closed her eyes, letting the music consume her, momentarily forgetting where she was, forgetting him. When she opened her eyes, Enzo was standing in a doorway, a silent, imposing shadow. How long had he been there? She hadn't heard him. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He hadn't interrupted her, hadn't made a sound, just watched. A strange warmth, unbidden and unwanted, bloomed in her chest. A fleeting sense of connection, raw and potent. "You play beautifully," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, almost a whisper. It was the closest thing to praise, to gentleness, she had received from him. "It's all I have left," she replied, her voice husky, suddenly vulnerable. He stepped further into the room, his gaze still fixed on her hands on the keys. "It is a gift, a valuable one." He moved to a nearby armchair and sat, his posture relaxed yet alert, a coiled spring. "Play something else." And so she did. She played for him, a strange, dangerous intimacy blossoming between them in the quiet hum of the penthouse. He listened, utterly absorbed, his eyes never leaving her, a profound intensity in their depths. In those moments, the shadows seemed to recede, revealing glimpses of a man who appreciated beauty, who understood the language of the soul. It was unsettling, this unexpected facet of his character. It complicated things. It made him less of a monster and more of an enigma. Days turned into a week. Serafina found herself falling into a routine, a bizarre rhythm dictated by Enzo's unseen hand. She practiced piano for hours, sometimes alone, sometimes aware of his distant presence. She often overheard snippets of his business calls, harsh, decisive words spoken in Italian, the unmistakable undertone of power and threat. It was a stark reminder of the dangerous world he commanded, the world she was now irrevocably a part of. She knew with chilling certainty that the opulence around her was built on a foundation of ruthless strength and violence. Yet his protection was absolute. She felt it, a palpable shield around her, keeping her safe from external threats she didn't even know existed. One afternoon, a delivery of new sheet music arrived, rare first edition jazz compositions, precisely the kind she adored but could never afford. An anonymous gift, but she knew it came from him. He anticipated her desires, satisfied her needs, even as he denied her autonomy. It was a push and pull, a constant conflict between gratitude and resentment, fear and a reluctant, dangerous fascination. She found herself observing him, trying to piece together the man behind the shadow, the meticulous way he dressed, the piercing intelligence in his eyes, the almost imperceptible shifts in his demeanor when he was displeased. He was a force of nature, a dangerous, beautiful storm, and she was caught in its eye. Her resolve to resist, to escape, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a bewildering mix of emotions. The fear of him remained, but was now laced with an undeniable curiosity, a simmering attraction she fought to suppress. He was dangerous, ruthless, and utterly possessive, but he was also captivating. He saw her, truly saw her talent, her passion, in a way no one else ever had. And in his dark, unyielding gaze, she saw a promise of absolute, unshakable protection. A golden cage, perhaps, but one that felt strangely, terrifyingly safe. She watched him from across the vast living room one evening, as he spoke tersely into a phone, his back to her, his profile sharp against the cityscape. He was discussing someone named Vitali, his voice low and firm, almost menacing. He ended the call, turned, and his eyes immediately found hers. A familiar, possessive glint entered them, a silent claim. She knew, with a sudden chilling certainty, that she was truly his. And just as she accepted that terrifying truth, a subtle shift occurred in his expression, a hardening. He had seen something in her eyes, something that perhaps mirrored his own growing, dangerous obsession. But the outside world, the one he commanded with such ruthless efficiency, was still very much alive, and it was about to remind them both of its existence. A fragile peace had settled over Seraphina's gilded cage. The constant gnawing fear of Silas Thorne had receded, replaced by the omnipresent, albeit less immediate, awareness of Enzo Moretti's suffocating control. She spent her days playing the piano in the penthouse's small music room, the melodies her only true escape. Enzo often listened, a silent, unmoving shadow in the doorway, his eyes never leaving her. It was a strange dynamic, this silent appreciation from a man whose world was built on violence and acquisition. She still bristled under his possessiveness, the undeniable sense of being owned, but a reluctant gratitude had begun to bloom in the desolate garden of her heart. He kept her safe. He provided for her. He listened to her music as if it were the only sound that truly mattered. One crisp autumn morning, a thick, cream-colored envelope appeared on the antique writing desk in her room. It wasn't from Enzo. His communications were usually direct, spoken with that low, dangerous rumble, or delivered by one of his silent, unblinking men. This envelope was different. It felt personal and menacing. The paper was heavy, expensive, with an embossed, unfamiliar crest. A shiver traced its way down her spine as she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single, withered, blood-red rose. Its petals were bruised, its stem snapped, and beneath it a note scrawled in an elegant looping hand, not Thorne's crude scrawl. Pretty bird. Too pretty for a viper's cage. Some cages can be opened, even with a broken key. Thorne sends his regards and his regrets. He wishes he had kept you for himself. But perhaps I still can. No signature. Just the chilling implication. Seraphina's breath hitched in her throat. The fragile peace shattered, replaced by an icy dread that permeated her very bones. Or, even gone, he was a shadow, pulling strings from the darkness, reaching for her. This wasn't just a random threat. It was targeted. It meant someone from his network, someone powerful enough to penetrate Enzo's seemingly impenetrable defenses, was still out there. And they wanted her. Her hands trembled, the rose petals crumbling in her grasp like dried blood. She clutched the note, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird once more. Every shadow in the luxurious penthouse suddenly seemed to lengthen, to twist into menacing shapes. She wasn't safe. Not truly. Not even in Enzo Moretti's golden cage. Later that afternoon, Enzo found her by the large living room windows, staring out at the sprawling city, a crumpled note clutched in her hand. His presence, as always, was a silent invasion. She hadn't heard him approach. Something troubles you, Kara. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet it held a distinct edge she hadn't heard before. It was the sound of a predator sensing disruption in its territory. She slowly turned, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't hide. She held out the note, her hand shaking. It was in my room. Enzo took the note, his dark eyes scanning the elegant script, his expression hardening with each word. The withered rose, still on the desk, seemed to draw his gaze. His jaw tightened, a muscle clenching visibly. The subtle scent of expensive cologne around him seemed to sharpen, laced with something cold, metallic. Thorne is incapacitated, he stated, his voice dangerously soft. He cannot send his regards. Then someone else did, Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible. Someone from his world. Someone who thinks I'm still a weakness. Enzo's gaze, which had been fixed on the note, now lifted to meet hers. There was no anger at her, only a simmering, controlled fury that radiated from him, an almost palpable heat. The air in the room suddenly felt charged, heavy with unspoken threats. His eyes, usually just dark, now seemed to burn with a dangerous, infernal light. "They are mistaken," he said, his voice a low, lethal growl. "You are not a weakness, Serafina. You are mine, and no one touches what is mine." He made a call, speaking rapid, guttural Italian into his phone. Serafina understood little of the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was an order, cold and absolute. His voice held a chilling finality that promised swift, brutal retribution. She watched him, mesmerized and terrified, as he transformed from the silent observer into the ruthless Mafia boss, the shadow fully unleashed. The next few hours were a blur of hushed activity. Enzo was a whirlwind of controlled intensity. More of his men appeared, silent and formidable, moving with an almost military precision. He gave orders, his commands crisp and unyielding, his eyes burning with a cold fire. Serafina remained in the penthouse, unable to leave, a terrified witness to the awakening of his dangerous world. Then, late that night, a series of rapid, terse calls came in. Enzo listened, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He paced the vast living room, his movements panther-like, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Serafina, a possessive, protective gleam in their depths. Finally, he ended a call, his lips curved into a chilling, almost imperceptible smile that held no warmth, only triumph. He turned to her, his dark eyes still alight with the echoes of violence. "Vitali," he said, the name sounding like a death knell on his lips. "An old associate of Thorn. Foolish man. Thought he could leverage my property." His gaze sharpened, possessive and unwavering. "He thought he could use you to send a message to me. He sent one to you instead." Serafina held her breath. What happened?" Enzo merely shrugged, a subtle, dismissive gesture that belied the ruthlessness she knew lay beneath. "Vitali's operations are no longer operational. His assets have been seized. His men have disappeared. And he himself will trouble no one again, ever." The implication hung in the air, cold and undeniable. Enzo hadn't merely neutralized a threat, he had eradicated it. He hadn't just protected her, he had demonstrated, in the most brutal and definitive terms, the consequences of daring to touch what belonged to him. Serafina felt a profound shock course through her. Her stomach churned, a knot of mingled terror and something else she couldn't quite name. She had known he was dangerous, had glimpsed his ruthless power. But to witness the swift, absolute finality of his justice carried out in the shadows was a different matter entirely. It was terrifying. And yet, a strange, dark sense of awe began to stir within her. He had acted, not with a public display of anger, but with cold, calculated precision. He annihilated a threat that sought to harm her, to exploit her. She was safe. He had made her safe. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not just as her captor, but as her formidable, unyielding protector. He was a monster, yes, a creature of the dark. But his monstrosity was aimed outwards, shielding her from the even greater terrors of the world. A grudging admiration, a terrifying understanding, began to take root in her heart. This was his world. A world of shadows, a brutal power, where debts were paid in blood, and claims were enforced with merciless finality. And she, Serafina, was now inextricably bound to it, protected by the most dangerous man of all. As Enzo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, she instinctively recoiled, but then held her ground. His hand reached out, not to threaten, but to gently cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His dark eyes, still burning with the residual heat of his fury, softened imperceptibly as they met hers. "No one," he repeated, his voice a low, possessive growl that seemed to vibrate through her very soul, will ever touch you again. Not while you are mine." The words were a chilling vow, a terrifying promise. And as she gazed into his dangerous, protective eyes, Serafina knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that he meant every single one. Her life in the golden cage was far from simple, far from truly free. But in this moment, amidst the whispers of violence, she also felt an undeniable absolute security. A security bought with blood, claimed by a king, and irrevocably hers. The aftermath of Vitali's swift and brutal demise left Serafina in a state of unsettling suspension. The terror had been acute, raw, and visceral. But now it was replaced by a cold, quiet dread, mingled with an even more terrifying emotion, a dangerous, inexplicable. Enzo Moretti had not merely protected her. He had decimated a threat with the efficiency of a silent, unfeeling force of nature. She had witnessed the true extent of his power, the ruthless machinery that operated beneath the gleaming surface of his world, and it was horrifying. Yet she was safe. Utterly, irrevocably safe. The paradox of it churned in her gut. She found herself gravitating towards the piano in the penthouse music room, her fingers itching for the keys, for the familiar comfort of melody. But the music wouldn't come. Her mind replayed the scene of Enzo's cold fury, the chilling finality in his voice when he spoke of Vitali. He was a monster. She knew it with every fiber of her being. But he was her monster. And that thought, as terrifying as it was, settled a strange, heavy calm over her. She sat at the piano, but instead of playing, she merely traced the polished ebony. The cool, smooth surface, a stark contrast to the burning confusion within her. Her heart still pounded with the ghost of fear, but beneath it, a desperate need for understanding had begun to surface. She couldn't live in this gilded cage, protected by a man whose darkness she only half understood, without trying to bridge the chasm between them. The soft click of the door opening startled her. Enzo stood there, as he often did, a silent sentinel. His eyes, dark and fathomless, met hers across the room. There was no judgment in them, only an intense, unwavering observation. He still wore the immaculate suit from earlier, not a crease out of place, as if the brutality of the night had not touched him. "You are restless," he observed, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that resonated in the quiet room. He didn't ask, he stated. "I'm alive," Serafina retorted, her voice sharper than she intended, a sliver of her defiance reasserting itself. "And I'm safe. Because of you. But I don't understand." Her gaze pleaded with him, searching for something, anything, beneath the impenetrable facade. Why did you go to such lengths? For me?" Enzo slowly walked further into the room, his movements fluid, deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the piano, his imposing presence filling her periphery. "I told you. You are mine, and no one touches what is mine." His words were a wall, but she sensed a crack, a tremor of something deeper beneath them. "Is that all I am? Property?" She pushed, her voice laced with a raw vulnerability she couldn't suppress. "A possession to be protected?" Her fingers trembled as they rested on the keys, unable to coax a sound from them. "My father died for this place. The sapphire. He gambled away everything trying to keep it alive. And I was doing the same. What is it you want from me, Enzo? What is the cost of this of protection?" He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, dissecting her. She expected anger, a dismissive retort. Instead, his eyes softened infinitesimally, revealing a flicker of something akin to weariness, a profound melancholy she hadn't seen before. "Cost," he finally said, his voice now lower, almost a whisper that carried immense weight. "The cost is everything. It always is." He turned away from her, walking towards the large window, his back to her, silhouetted against the glittering cityscape. "My father, he was a good man, strong. He built this empire, brick by a bloody brick. But he was trusting. And in this world, trust is a fatal flaw." Serafina held her breath, mesmerized by this unexpected glimpse into his past. He rarely spoke of himself, of his family. He was the shadow, a force, not a man with a history. He lost everything he truly valued, piece by piece, to betrayal. Enzo continued, his voice devoid of emotion, yet heavy with a distant pain. He watched it burn, and he never forgave himself for not being strong enough to stop it, for not being ruthless enough to protect what was his. He paused, his broad shoulders tensed. I learned from his mistakes. I built an empire of iron, not trust, so that nothing and no one I deem mine will ever be touched. He turned back to her, his gaze intense, piercing, but now tinged with a vulnerability she hadn't dared to imagine. When I saw you, Serafina, at the Viper's Den, broken, humiliated, about to be devoured by a rat like Thorn, I saw my father's ghost. I saw what happens when one is too soft, too unprotected. And I knew in that moment that you would be mine to protect. That you had to be. His voice dropped to a possessive rumble. I will not make my father's mistakes. What I claim, I keep, and I protect with everything I have. A tremor went through Serafina. It wasn't just about property for him. It was about a deep, ingrained code of honor, a brutal, twisted form of love born from loss and betrayal. He saw her as something he had to protect, an extension of his own formidable will, perhaps even a second chance to rectify the perceived failures of his past. The truth was dark, possessive, and utterly heartbreaking, and it made a strange kind of sense. The sapphire, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My father, he just wanted to keep the music alive. It was his life. My life. A beat of silence. Then a subtle shift in Enzo's expression. The sapphire is being taken care of. What do you mean? She asked, a flicker of hope piercing through her despair. Come, he said, and for the first time he offered her his hand. It was a large, powerful hand, not without scars, but impeccably groomed. The gesture was unexpected, a silent invitation. Hesitantly, Serafina took it. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly dominant. He led her from the penthouse, past his silent men, into the private elevator that descended with dizzying speed. Her heart pounded, a mixture of trepidation and a burgeoning, dangerous curiosity. Where was he taking her? The elevator doors hissed open, not into the anonymous bustle of the city street, but into a dimly lit underground garage. A sleek, black luxury sedan awaited them, engine idling silently. One of his men opened the back door. Enzo guided her in, then slid in beside her, the scent of his cologne enveloping her. The drive was short, tense. They pulled up in front of a familiar, yet strangely unfamiliar building. The Sapphire Lounge. But something was different. The old peeling paint was gone, replaced by a fresh, deep sapphire blue that gleamed under the streetlights. The warped S on the neon sign had been painstakingly repaired, now glowing with a vibrant, welcoming light. As Enzo's man unlocked the heavy oak doors, a wave of familiar yet foreign scent washed over her, not the stale ghost of the past, but the clean, sharp smell of fresh wood, new paint, and polish. Serafina stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The place was transformed. The tattered velvet curtains had been replaced by rich, new ones, a deep, velvety blue. The scuffed wooden floor gleamed, sanded and polished to a mirror shine. The booths were reupholstered in a plush, dark fabric. And on the stage, her father's grand piano. It was no longer chipped and dusty. It gleamed, every key perfectly restored, its wood polished to a warm, inviting luster. She walked towards it, her hand hovering over the keys, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't just restored, it was revitalized, given a new life. And she knew without a doubt that this was Enzo's doing. This was his way of showing he cared about her passion, about her history, about the thing that made her her. I had my men find the original schematics, Enzo said, his voice soft, standing just behind her, his presence a warm, unyielding wall. The club's structure, its soul, it is being honored. Your music will have the stage it deserves. Serafina turned to him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, her heart aching with a bewildering mix of gratitude, wonder, and a deep, unsettling connection. He was a ruthless monster, but he had given her back her heart. He had seen past the waitress, past the debt, to the core of who she was. And he had nurtured it. Enzo. Her voice was a fragile whisper. She couldn't find the words. He reached out, his powerful hand gently cupping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his intense gaze. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, a possessive, almost tender gesture that sent a jolt of fire through her. This is part of the claim, Serafina. Your passion is mine to cultivate. Your dreams are mine to protect. His eyes, usually so cold, now held a burning intensity, a dangerous tenderness that pulled her in, threatening to drown her. In that moment, surrounded by the silent testament to his dark, possessive care, Serafina felt an undeniable, magnetic pull towards him, perilous fascination that transcended fear. She knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her heart, as well as her life, was now irrevocably bound to this dangerous man. And she was beginning to wonder if she even wanted to be free. The Sapphire Lounge, now gleaming under its fresh coat of sapphire paint, no longer smelled of ghosts. Instead, the rich, clean scent of polished wood and fresh upholstery filled the air, a stark contrast to the lingering anxieties in Serafina's heart. Enzo had given her back her legacy, a grand gesture that had shaken her to her core. He had shown her a vulnerability, a raw pain rooted in his father's past, and in doing so, had offered a terrifying glimpse into the man beneath the shadow. It had deepened the bewildering magnetism between them, forging a fragile, dangerous bond built on his possessive protection and her reluctant, growing understanding. Yet, a part of her, stubborn and resilient, still yearned for true autonomy. The penthouse, despite its unparalleled luxury, remained a gilded cage. She could play her music, read her books, wander its vast spaces, but she couldn't leave. Not without Enzo's explicit permission, which was rarely given, and always accompanied by a phalanx of his silent, watchful men. It was a freedom of choice within a very narrow, very defined perimeter. One afternoon, a week after the club's restoration was largely complete, Serafina found herself staring at the gleaming keys of her father's piano. The sapphire was ready. She longed to simply be there alone, to feel the space breathe without Enzo's omnipresent gaze, without the constant awareness of his power. It was a foolish, reckless desire, she knew, but it was a part of her she couldn't silence. She approached Enzo that evening as he reviewed documents in his study, the rich scent of old paper and new leather clinging to the air. "I want to go to the club," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Alone, just for a few hours. To play, to feel the music in my space." Enzo slowly raised his head, his dark eyes meeting hers, piercing through her composure. He paused, his gaze unreadable, and for a fleeting moment, she feared his inevitable refusal. Alone, he finally rumbled, his voice low, a question and a challenge. "Yes, alone," she insisted, squaring her shoulders. "Just for a little while. To connect with it. To remember." She added, almost as an afterthought, "It would mean a lot to me." He watched her for another long, silent moment. The air in the study thickened, charged with unspoken power. Then, to her utter surprise, he nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible dip of his head. "1 hour. 2 men will take you. They will wait outside. You will not leave the premises of the Sapphire Lounge." Understood. Relief, sharp and potent, flooded her. Understood. She breathed, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "Thank you, Enzo." He said nothing more, merely returned his attention to his papers, a silent dismissal. But as she left the study, she felt the lingering weight of his gaze on her back. The drive to the Sapphire Lounge felt exhilarating, a taste of freedom, even with 2 imposing men in the front seat. The cool night air, pressing against the car windows, felt crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the filtered air of the penthouse. When they pulled up, the newly illuminated sign of the Sapphire glowed warmly, a beacon of hope against the encroaching darkness. Her escorts remained in the idling car as Serafina, a faint tremor of excitement running through her, unlocked the heavy oak doors. The scent of her club enveloped her, stronger now, more welcoming. She walked straight to the piano, her fingers tingling with anticipation. She sat down, her hands hovering over the keys, a deep sigh escaping her. This was her. This was her space. Her music. She began to play. A soft, melancholic jazz improvisation, weaving together threads of her despair, her stolen past, and the terrifying magnetic presence of Enzo Moretti. The notes swelled and faded, filling the empty club, raw and vulnerable, a true reflection of her turbulent soul. She played for almost an hour, lost in the music, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since her father's passing. As the last note died away, a profound quiet settled. She closed her eyes, letting the silence embrace her, a balm to her weary spirit. Then she heard it. Not a sound from outside, not the quiet hum of the street, but a faint, almost imperceptible scuff from inside the club, from behind the bar. Her eyes snapped open. The peace vanished, replaced by an icy dread. She was alone, or so she thought. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening. Another soft thud, floorboard creaking. Someone was in here with her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a thin, shaky whisper, barely carrying in the large space. Silence. Too much silence. Her mind raced, a frantic search for logical explanations. A stray cat? A maintenance worker? No, Enzo's men would have seen them. She slowly rose from the piano bench, her legs trembling. Every shadow in the club seemed to deepen, to take on menacing forms. The heavy doors were still locked behind her, she remembered. But what about the back entrance? A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Then a figure slowly emerged from the shadows behind the bar. Not Enzo. Not one of his men. A man she recognized, with a sickening lurch in her gut. Angelo. One of Silas Thorne's most brutal enforcers. A man with a scarred face and eyes that held only malice. He wasn't alone. Another figure, bulkier and equally menacing, stood beside him. Well, 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 Angelo sneered, a cruel smile stretching his scarred lips. Look what the viper dragged in. A pretty little songbird, all alone in her pretty new cage. Serafina's blood ran cold. Or, he wasn't incapacitated. He was alive, and he had found her. How? How had they bypassed Enzo's men? You shouldn't be here, she stammered, backing away slowly, her eyes darting frantically towards the heavy oak door. It felt miles away. Oh, but we should, Angelo chuckled, stepping from behind the bar, moving towards her with slow, deliberate pace that filled her with absolute terror. Thorne sends his regards. He said you were too valuable to let go. And Enzo Moretti, well, he made a fool of himself, didn't he? Thinking he could just buy you without consequence. His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. A crushing betrayal. Enzo had promised protection. He had shown her his vulnerability, his care. And now, in her moment of deepest peril, he was nowhere. His impenetrable defenses had been breached. His claim, his vows, had been utterly meaningless. She was just a pawn in their dangerous games, an object to be stolen, traded, and now undoubtedly destroyed. He'll kill you, Serafina whispered, trying to project a defiance she didn't feel, hoping the name Enzo would still carry weight. Angelo laughed, harsh, guttural sound that grated on her nerves. Oh, he'll try. But by then, you'll be long gone. Thorne has a special place for disobedient little birds, Miss Santos. A very special place indeed. He lunged. Serafina screamed, raw primal sound ripped from her throat. She tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. The second man, moving with terrifying speed, cut off her escape route to the door. Angelo grabbed her, his fingers digging into her arms with brutal force, yanking her backwards. The world spun. She struggled, kicking and twisting, fueled by a desperate, animalistic terror. But they were too strong, too numerous. A thick, musky cloth was clapped over her mouth and nose. The sweet, cloying scent of chloroform filled her nostrils, burning and suffocating. Her struggles weakened. Her vision blurred, the vibrant blues of the renovated club swirling into a dark, suffocating vortex. Her last conscious thought, as the darkness claimed her, was not of fear for herself, but a profound, agonizing loneliness. Enzo. He had failed her. His protection was a lie. She was utterly, completely alone, swallowed whole by the darkness she had desperately tried to escape. And this time she doubted anyone, even Enzo Moretti, could ever find her again. The black moment had arrived, cold and absolute, pulling her down into an abyss of despair from which there seemed no escape. The first phone call came as Enzo Moretti was reviewing quarterly ledgers, the numbers sharp and unforgiving, much like the man himself. It was a routine check-in from his men, stationed discreetly outside the Sapphire Lounge. The report was concise, delivered with a tremor of urgency Enzo rarely heard. "Sir, Miss Santos is gone. The back door was forced. Our men, they were incapacitated. Professional job." The blood in Enzo's veins turned to ice. He slammed the phone down, the expensive device cracking against the marble desk. Gone. Serafina. His Serafina. The word resonated in his mind, a primal scream of ownership and terror. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was the chilling calm before a storm of unimaginable fury. His dark eyes, usually cold and calculating, ignited with a terrifying, infernal fire. A muscle in his jaw clenched, so tight it threatened to crack bone. This wasn't merely a breach of his security. It was an act of war, a declaration of defiance against his absolute authority. They had dared to touch what was his. "Find her," he growled into his intercom, his voice a low, guttural vibration that made even his most hardened consigliere flinch. "Every man, every resource. Tear this city apart. I want every alley, every warehouse, every hole they might crawl into. And I want Thorn, and anyone foolish enough to work with him. Bring them to me, alive if possible. But if not, their bodies will send the message." His penthouse, usually a bastion of quiet order, erupted into a frenzy of activity. Phones rang, doors slammed, footsteps pounded. Enzo moved with a lethal grace, shedding the composed facade of the businessman, embracing the full, terrifying persona of the shadow. He barked orders in rapid, brutal Italian, his commands precise, unforgiving. His network, vast and insidious, was activated, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the city's underbelly. Surveillance feeds flickered across screens. Informants were roused from their sleep. Threats were delivered with cold, surgical precision. Serafina. The image of her terrified eyes, the way her hands had trembled when she played the piano, the quiet defiance in her spirit, it all fueled a rage so profound, so absolute, it threatened to consume him. He had shown her a vulnerability, a piece of his past, allowed himself to feel a dangerous tenderness. And they had taken her. They would pay. In blood. Serafina's consciousness flickered in and out, a cruel dance between suffocating darkness and searing pain. The chloroform had worn off, leaving her head throbbing, her throat raw. She was in a cold, damp space, smelling of stale concrete, mildew, and something metallic that made her stomach churn. A warehouse, perhaps. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her, chafing against rough rope. Her ankles, too. Every movement sent a jolt of agony through her. Through the haze of pain, she heard voices. Angelo's sneering laughter, Thorn's smooth, venomous tones. He was alive, and he wanted revenge. Her blood ran cold. "He thinks he can just buy what's ours, Angelo?" Thorn's voice, closer now, made her flinch. "Moretti thinks he can make a fool of Silas Thorn. He'll learn. He'll learn that some things are not for sale. Some debts are paid personally." A chill snaked down Serafina's spine. Thorn didn't just want her. He wanted to hurt Enzo through her. She was a weapon, a pawn in their deadly game. Despair, crushing and absolute, washed over her. Enzo had failed. His protection was not enough. She was truly, irrevocably lost. Enzo stood over a terrified informant, his hand curled around a man's throat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground. Where is she? His voice was barely a whisper, yet it held the force of a thunderclap. The old docks. Warehouse in 19. Thorn, he's there. And Vivatali's men, they're watching the approaches. The man choked out, his eyes wide with fear. Enzo dropped him, the man collapsing in a heap. Move, he roared, already striding towards the door, his formidable security detail scrambling to keep pace. The address ignited a fresh surge of primal fury. The old docks. A place of forgotten things, of brutal deals, of silent disappearances. Perfect for Thorn's depraved game. He was in the lead car, his driver pushing the gleaming black sedan to its absolute limits, weaving through the late-night traffic with reckless abandon. The city became a blur of streaking lights, a backdrop to his singular, all-consuming focus, Serafina. He visualized her face, her fear, the vulnerability he had sworn to protect. The images stoked the fires of his rage, refining it into a weapon. Serafina was dragged to her feet, her legs weak, her head still swimming. Angelo held her, his grip bruising. Thorn stood before her, a knife glinting wickedly in his hand, its cold edge caressing her cheek. Such soft skin, Thorn murmured, his eyes lingering on her, a sick glint of ownership in their depths. Moretti will pay dearly for this. He took my future. I'll take his. He chuckled, a vile, self-satisfied sound, starting with his prized little songbird's voice. A shame, really. Such talent, terror, raw and overwhelming, flooded Serafina. Her vision blurred, her body trembling uncontrollably. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, for the agony that was coming. Enzo. The name was a silent plea, a desperate, hopeless prayer. Suddenly, a deafening crash ripped through the warehouse. The heavy metal door, reinforced and bolted, exploded inwards with a tremendous roar, torn from its hinges as if by a monstrous claw. Dust and debris rained down. Enzo Moretti stood in the gaping maw of the entrance, framed against the swirling night. Not just Enzo. An army of his men, a silent, disciplined phalanx, poured into the warehouse behind him, weapons gleaming under the harsh industrial lights. But it was Enzo's face that commanded all attention. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His eyes, burning with an incandescent rage, immediately found Serafina. A primal, possessive roar tore from his throat, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Moretti! Thorn shrieked, his face contorting in a mixture of fear and disbelief. You're too late. He tightened his grip on Serafina, pressing the cold, sharp blade to her throat, a desperate human shield. Release her, Enzo growled, his voice low, vibrating with lethal intent, and I might let you live to regret this. Angelo, reacting with instinct, pulled Serafina closer, the knife now a desperate barrier between her and Enzo's wrath. Take one more step, Moretti, and the girl dies. Enzo didn't break stride. His eyes, fixed on Serafina's terrified face, held a promise of absolute devotion and a chilling, unwavering command. He was a force of nature, a predator unleashed. His men, moving with ruthless efficiency, began to engage Thorn's scattered thugs, a symphony of muffled gunshots and brutal, close-quarters combat erupting around them. Thorn, emboldened by his perceived advantage, pressed the knife harder against Serafina's throat, drawing a thin line of crimson. Serafina cried out, a small, choked gasp of pain and terror. That was a mistake. A fatal mistake. Enzo's rage, already at a boiling point, surged. He didn't speak. He didn't warn. He simply moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for the eye to follow. He was suddenly there, a dark, unstoppable whirlwind. His hand shot out, not at Thorn, but at Angelo, a lightning-fast strike that disarmed the brute in a single brutal movement. Angelo crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the concrete. Then Enzo's gaze locked onto Thorn, pure murder in its depths. Thorn, momentarily stunned by Angelo's sudden collapse, barely registered Enzo's approach before a hand, powerful as a vice, seized his wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. With a swift, sickening twist, Enzo snapped Thorn's arm, a grotesque crack echoing in the chaos. Thorn screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. Enzo didn't stop. He grabbed Thorn by the lapels, lifting him off his feet, his face inches from Thorn's, his obsidian eyes burning into the other man's soul. "You dared to touch what is mine," he snarled, his voice a low, terrifying snarl. "You will regret every breath you have left." He flung Thorn aside like a rag doll, sending him sprawling into the broken concrete, a broken, whimpering mess. Serafina, released, crumpled to the ground, sobbing, her body racked with tremors. But before she could even register the relief, Enzo was there. He dropped to his knees beside her, his large, powerful hands immediately finding her face, cupping her cheeks gently, his thumbs brushing away her tears. His gaze swept over her, searching for injuries, his furious expression softening only slightly as his eyes found the thin cut on her throat. "Serafina," he breathed, his voice raw, laced with an intensity that pierced through her terror. It was a desperate plea, a statement of ownership, a promise of eternal devotion, all wrapped in that single utterance of her name. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she didn't care. She clung to him, burying her face against his expensive suit, sobbing uncontrollably, the scent of him, of danger and protection, filling her senses. Around them, the sounds of the battle were fading. Enzo's men had secured the warehouse, the remaining thugs neutralized, either captured or worse. But for Enzo, only Serafina mattered. He held her, his body trembling with the aftershocks of his fury, his unbridled love for her, his desperate relief at having found her, safe in his arms. She was his, and the world would burn before he ever let her go again. He knew it, and now she knew it too. This was his claim, solidified in blood and fire. The warehouse was a chaotic symphony of violence and retribution. Gunshots echoed, sharp and brutal, followed by guttural shouts and the sickening thud of bodies. But in Enzo's arms, pressed tightly against his chest, Serafina heard none of it. Her world had shrunk to the rhythmic thump of his heart, a powerful, steady drum against her ear, and the reassuring, possessive pressure of his embrace. She clung to him, trembling uncontrollably, the residue of fear and the cloying scent of chloroform still clinging to her, but beneath it, the undeniable warmth of his body was a lifeline. He held her for a long moment, simply held her, his large hands stroking her hair, a silent promise of protection. The raw fury that had contorted his features moments ago had receded, replaced by a grim, unwavering resolve. He was a storm, and she was in its calm, terrifying eye. Finally, he pulled back slightly, his dark eyes sweeping over her face, searching for injury, for lingering terror. His gaze landed on the faint, crimson line on her throat where Thorn's knife had pressed. A flicker of his earlier rage sparked in their depths, cold and lethal. "Are you hurt, Kara?" His voice was a low, rough whisper, laced with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Serafina shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with unshed tears and the lingering fear. She was alive. She was safe. But the ordeal had left her hollowed out, her spirit raw. Enzo scooped her into his arms, effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing. The sudden motion startled her, but she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder. The scent of him, expensive cologne, a faint tang of gun smoke, and something uniquely, dangerously masculine, filled her senses, a strange, intoxicating comfort. He carried her through the wreckage of the warehouse, past the groaning figures of Thorn's defeated men, past his own disciplined soldiers who moved with quiet efficiency, securing the perimeter. No one dared to meet Enzo's gaze or hers. His aura was absolute, his fury still palpable in the air. The drive back to the penthouse was a blur. Serafina sat beside him in the back of the sleek black sedan, still trembling. Enzo never once released her hand. His fingers laced tightly with hers, a constant grounding pressure. His silent strength was a shield, his presence a fortress against the echoing horrors in her mind. Once in the penthouse, he didn't hand her over to his staff. He carried her himself to her bedroom, bypassing the surprised glances of his housekeeper. He gently set her down on the edge of the plush bed, his eyes still fixed on her, assessing, protective. A bath, he murmured, his voice softer now, devoid of the harshness of his world. Warm. To wash away the grime. He walked into the en-suite bathroom, and Serafina heard the rush of water. She sat on the bed, her body feeling heavy, disconnected from her mind. The humiliation, the terror, the crushing despair of being truly alone, it all cycled through her, a nauseating loop. Enzo returned, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive shirt, revealing powerful forearms scarred with faint, almost invisible lines. He knelt before her, his dark eyes serious, his hand gently touching her forehead. Come. She rose, still in a daze, and let him lead her. The bathroom was filled with steam, the air fragrant with essential oils. He had drawn the bath himself. He sat on the edge of the tub, his gaze unwavering as she slowly, awkwardly, began to unbutton her ruined uniform. Her hands shook, fumbling with the tiny buttons. Without a word, he reached out, his strong fingers expertly unfastening the remaining buttons. His touch was impersonal, yet utterly intimate, a tender invasion of her privacy. Her breath hitched. She looked into his eyes, searching for lust, but found only an unyielding concern, a deep-seated need to see her safe, healed. It was a bizarre, profoundly affecting paradox. He helped her step into the warm, fragrant water, his hand supporting her, careful not to look away from her face, respecting her unspoken vulnerability. The heat of the water was a shock, then a blessed relief, seeping into her aching muscles. She closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath, finally feeling the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Enzo didn't leave. He simply sat there, a silent, formidable guardian, his dark eyes never leaving her, a possessive anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. Later, wrapped in a thick plush robe provided by his silent staff, Serafina sat curled on the sofa in her room, a cup of warm tea in her hands. She felt physically better, but the echoes of her trauma still resonated. From a distant wing of the penthouse, faint, muffled sounds occasionally reached her ears, shouts, then a chilling, guttural scream, abruptly cut short. Then silence. Then more muffled sounds. Her blood ran cold. She knew what those sounds meant. Enzo's reckoning. His justice. A cold, ruthless fear settled over her, but beneath it, a strange, undeniable understanding began to bloom. This was the cost of crossing him. The cost of daring to touch his property. And she, in her twisted heart, felt a profound, dangerous sense of gratitude. This was the dark side of his protection, the merciless force that ensured her safety. He eventually came to her, hours later, the faint scent of something metallic, something cold and final, clinging to his dark suit. His expression was grim, his eyes still holding that dangerous, distant fire, but when they met hers, they softened. He sat beside her, not touching her, but his presence was an enveloping heat, a comforting weight. Thorn, he said, his voice low, almost devoid of emotion, and his men, they will trouble you no more. Ever. His words carried an absolute finality, a chilling certainty that left no room for doubt. Serafina looked at him, truly looked at him. She saw the ruthlessness, the unyielding power, the darkness that was as inherent to him as the air he breathed. And she realized, with a clarity that both terrified and profoundly reassured her, that this darkness was now her shield. His violence was for her. His vengeance was her protection. Ah, I understand, she whispered, her voice still a little hoarse. It wasn't a lie. She didn't condone the brutality, but she understood its necessity in his world. In their world, Enzo reached out, his hand slowly, gently, cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing over the thin cut on her throat, a silent caress that sent a jolt through her. His gaze was intense, possessive, yet now infused with a raw, undeniable tenderness. "You are safe, Serafina," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vow that resonated deep within her soul. "You are mine, and no one will ever forget that again." In that moment, nestled in the terrifying, dangerous peace of his presence, Serafina felt an overwhelming surge of emotions: fear, gratitude, a profound awe, and a startling, undeniable acceptance. She had traded one nightmare for another, yes, but this nightmare wore a tailored suit, listened to her music, and would tear apart the world to keep her safe. She had found her dangerous peace in his possessive claim, and as she leaned into his touch, her heart, once broken and humiliated, began to find a new, dark, and utterly secure beat. Was Serafina truly saved, or merely claimed by a different kind of darkness? Perhaps the truth lies not in labels, but in the echoes of her melody. Her journey from the suffocating grip of debt and humiliation to the dangerous, undeniable protection of Enzo Moretti asks us a profound question. Can love truly heal the deepest wounds, even when it arrives cloaked in shadows and possessive desire? Serafina's story is a fierce reminder that our past traumas, the moments when we felt most broken, most insignificant, do not define our worth. They are simply chapters in our unfolding narrative, moments that forge the steel of our spirit and deepen the soul's capacity for both vulnerability and an unbreakable resilience. Just like Serafina, many of us carry unseen burdens, silent scars from moments of humiliation, betrayal, or desperation. We may feel unseen, undervalued, or trapped in circumstances that threaten to extinguish our inner light. But this story whispers a powerful truth. Even in the darkest corners, a love can ignite, a protection can emerge that sees beyond our flaws, embraces our brokenness, and fiercely defends the very essence of who we are. It's a love that, while perhaps unconventional or even dangerous, ultimately allows us to reclaim our passions, rebuild our dreams, and find a profound sense of belonging. Your value isn't dictated by your past, your status, or your struggles. It's inherent. It's the unique song your soul sings. If Serafina's unwavering spirit and Enzo's fierce, protective love resonated with a part of your heart today, reminding you that you are worthy of being cherished, of being fought for, then you're not alone. We are a community who believes in the power of stories to heal, to inspire, and to remind us of the strength within. If this tale touched your soul, please honor it by leaving a like on this video, subscribing to join our growing family, and commenting below with the words, "Let's carry this message of hope and resilience forward together."